Two people face the same stressful task, and each is offered guided calm first. The one without an anxiety disorder takes it. The one with generalized anxiety rates staying worried as more helpful. Worry is supposed to be an attempt at calm. Measured, it does the opposite. It raises heart rate and holds it there 2 hours after the worrying stops. So, what is the worrying buying? The answer runs from Cicero to a drug trial in 1988. It begins where nobody thinks to look at what anxiety is about. Part 1. The audit you run at 3 in the morning. You wake at 3 and something is wrong, so you check. The job first, because it is always first. Nothing is due this week, nobody is angry, and Thursday's email came back with a one-word reply. Health next. The scan was clear. You still have the letter. Money. Rent is covered until spring, and you did that sum twice on a calculator. Then the people you love. All alive. All spoken to this week. Your mother's last message was about a bird on the feeder, and you read it again in the dark. 4 items. Everyone comes back clean, and the feeling does not move by a single degree. Tomorrow night you will run the same 4 items in the same order. You will run them well because this is the thing you are best at. Notice what you actually performed there. A search. You took the state as a message and assumed the message was about something. Then you went looking for the something across every part of your life large enough to hold it. You were doing what a responsible person does with an alarm. That is the standard theory of emotion, and you have been executing it correctly for years. The theory says that emotions are about things. Fear has an object. The dog, the deadline, the sound in the corridor downstairs. Remove the dog, and the fear goes with it. The fear was never freestanding, it was a relation to the dog. Grief is about a person who is gone. Anger is about someone who did something. On this picture, an unpleasant state is a state with a cause, and the cause is an item in the world. So the rational response to dread is to locate the item and deal with it. Nothing about that is naive. It is how the rent got covered until spring. The reasoning has 3 steps, and it is worth having them out loud. 1. A genuinely exhaustive search over everything you could be anxious about ought to terminate. Either the item turns up, or the state does not survive its absence. 2. Yours does not terminate. It came back empty at 3 this morning, and it will run again tomorrow at 3. Same 4 headings, same order. 3. So either the instrument is faulty, and you are searching badly, or the thing this state answers to is not the sort of thing that appears in a list of items. The third option is not new, and it is older than the discipline that thinks it invented it. In 45 BC, in the Tusculan Disputations, Cicero sets 2 Latin words apart. Angor is the acute physical kind of distress, the episode happening to you now. Anxietus is the standing disposition, the kind of person you are. His observation is 1 sentence long, and it cuts both ways at once. Not everyone who is sometimes distressed is an anxious person, and not everyone who is an anxious person is always distressed. He files it beside 2 pairs the ear can hold, being drunk once and being a drunkard, being in love and being a lover. That is the state and trait distinction credited to 20th century psychology, made 2,000 years earlier, in the word we still use for it, and it buys exactly what your 3 in the morning needs, because a person can be anxious while nothing distressing is occurring. The condition can outrun any episode that would explain it. Copenhagen, 1844. A short book called The Concept of Anxiety, published not under Kierkegaard's name, but under a pseudonym. The author on the title page is a watchman staged as a psychologist. The claim arrives as an answer to exactly the pressure you are under. Anxiety, he says, is different in kind from fear and from every other state that points at something definite. Its object is nothing, and the nothing is not a blank or an absence. The nothing is possibility. He calls the state the dizziness of freedom, and the bodily word is doing real work there. Dizziness at a height is not caused by the drop. It is caused by the eye losing its footing and finding nothing determinate to steady itself on. Cash that out against the paper in front of you. Nothing on your checklist is a possibility. Every single item on it is an actuality. The job as it stands, the scan as it came back, the balance as of Tuesday, your mother as of the message about the bird. A list can only contain what is the case, and what is the case is precisely the thing you are not anxious about. The checklist coming back clean is not the search failing. It is the search working, and reporting that the answer is not in the category you searched. That same cut gets drawn 3 times over a century and a half by people with almost nothing else in common. Kierkegaard sets angst against fear of something definite in 1844. In 1927, Heidegger separates Angst from Furcht. Fear, on his account, aims at some definite thing you could point to. Angst has no determinate object at all, and the threat cannot be pinned to any particular thing in the world. And modern American psychiatry rebuilds the line from the other end. The research framework used to fund neuroscience at the National Institute of Mental Health splits acute threat from potential threat. Acute threat it labels fear. Potential threat it labels anxiety, and its definition reads, harm may potentially occur but is distant, ambiguous, or low or uncertain in probability. A distinction that 3 traditions reach separately by different routes is worth taking seriously before anyone explains it away. The scale is not small, and the World Health Organization's current figure is that 359 million people had an anxiety disorder in 2021. That is about 4.4% of everyone alive, which makes anxiety disorders the most common of all mental disorders. Be careful with that number in the direction of honesty, because nobody counted those people. Researchers gathered every population survey they could find, fitted a model, and asked what the countries with no data probably look like. The number it returns is 359 million, and the same model says it could be meaningfully more or less. It is the best estimate anyone has, and it is an estimate. Here is where the whole thing might come apart. And it comes apart at the strongest point. Objectlessness is a report. When a person says, "There is nothing I'm anxious about," that sentence is a report on their introspective access. It says the reporting system could not locate an object. Introspection is a poor instrument for that, and you have no read access to the machinery running the alarm. The concession comes from the psychiatric framework itself. It does not define anxiety as objectless at all. It defines it by the properties of the threat. Harm may potentially occur, but is distant, ambiguous, or low or uncertain in probability. You already heard that definition as evidence for the distinction. Read it again and it says the opposite. That is an object at low resolution. On that reading, your audit failed for a dull reason. You searched the wrong range. You searched this month, and the system is tracking something 5 years out. You searched what is the case, and the system is tracking something unlikely that has no name yet. The reply the philosophers can make is real, and it is not a win. Take the second heading on your list, and the letter you still have. The list can hold what the scan found, which is nothing. It can hold the date, the wording, and the name of the doctor who signed it. Here is the one thing no line of that letter can hold. You are the one who has to go on from whatever it says. That is a property of the thing doing the searching. No search through the items could ever turn it up, which is what the philosophers mean by a modal fact about you. You are a being for whom things can be otherwise, which is why any result at all can be gone on from. So it sits on the wrong side of the line between you and the objects you are searching. You could search with perfect resolution, forever, and never find it in the list. The audit can return every item in the room, and it can never return the one running it. Neither side can currently do the one thing that would settle it. Nobody can say how far away an object has to be, or how unlikely before the two descriptions come apart. At what distance does a very faint object stop counting as an object? Nobody has an answer, and there is no measurement that gives one. That is a standoff. Which is the live question, and it is live now, in the journals, not in 1844. Two kinds, or two regions of one continuum. A 2011 review reports that the two measures overlap only moderately. If they were one thing measured twice, they would move together almost perfectly. On that report, they do not. An animal in a field where predators occur has met nothing. It has seen nothing and heard nothing. Its behavior changes anyway. It forages less often, eats more per visit, and approaches stretched out with its feet planted so it can pull back. Ask what it is afraid of, and there is no answer because there is no it. It is afraid of the field. On one account of defense, that is not a cousin of anxiety. It is anxiety. And the honest question that follows is whether you, at 3 in the morning, are doing anything more than that. So the search failed, and there are two readings of that failure alive on the table. They cannot both be right. One says the state has no object, and the clean checklist is a fact about the state. The other says the object is too far away and too diffuse to render, and the clean checklist is a fact about your equipment. That difference is the kind of thing an experiment could settle. If anyone could build a room in which genuinely nothing is happening. Part 2. How to manufacture dread in a room where nothing happens. A green triangle sits in the middle of a dark screen. Under it, one line of text. Shock at any time. The room is small and clean, with 2 electrodes taped to the inside of a wrist. Over the ears, headphones deliver a burst of white noise every 12 to 18 seconds, 105 decibels, 50 milliseconds long. Somewhere in the next 90 seconds, a shock arrives through the electrodes, and there is no way to say when. Later, the triangle is replaced by a blue circle, and the text changes. Shock only during the cue. It is the same shock, same intensity, same electrodes, same room, same person. The single thing that differs between those two blocks is whether the person can tell when it is coming. Everything else is held still, which is what makes this an experiment rather than an observation. Part 1 left a distinction sitting on the table. Fear has something in it to point at, and the state you wake into at 3 does not. Stated that way, it is a claim about vocabulary, and vocabulary is cheap. The green triangle turns it into a dial. Take a threat, remove nothing except its timing, and see whether the body files the result under the same heading. You cannot settle that by asking people how they feel, because the words they have available are the words under dispute. What the question needs is a measure that does not run through anybody's vocabulary. The one the field settled on is the startle reflex. A sudden loud noise makes you blink, and the size of that blink can be read off the muscle around the eye. It is an alarm wired directly into the body, and it does not consult you first. Its useful property is that it gets bigger when the person is already in an aversive state. So the same noise, burst, fired again and again, probes how braced a nervous system currently is. So run the blue circle block on yourself. The cue comes up 8 seconds, and while it is there, the shock can land. Your blink to the noise burst during those 8 seconds is enormous. Then the cue goes off, and in the empty stretch between cues, your blink drops back towards where it started. You are not relaxed exactly. You know where you are and what is on your wrist. But the gap is a real gap, and the body treats it as one. The rule of the block says that nothing can happen to you now. Now the green triangle. Same electrodes, same voltage, same number of shocks over the block, delivered at random. There is no cue to spike at. The startle stays elevated through the empty stretches when nothing whatsoever is on the screen and nothing is being done to anybody. Christian Grillon's group at the National Institute of Mental Health has been running versions of this since the 2000s. The ordering they report is clean. Measured in the quiet periods with no cue present, startle rises linearly from the no-shock block to the predictable block to the unpredictable one. Subtract the ability to say when, and the body stops spiking and starts idling high. Then a molecule sorted the two states along the same line. Give the person 1 milligram of alprazolam, the benzodiazepine sold as Xanax, and the spike to the blue circle is essentially untouched. The anti-anxiety drug does not stop you being afraid of a thing that is about to hurt you. What it lowers substantially is the plateau under the green triangle, and the control is the part that carries the weight. The benzodiazepine also lowered overall startle the way any sedative would. So an ordinary sedating antihistamine was given at a dose that matched that general sedation. It left the plateau exactly where it was. The compound finds the objectless condition and leaves the other one standing. And you do not even need electrodes. Remove 1 night's sleep from an ordinary person and their anxiety is higher the next day, with nothing about their circumstances altered. The 2020 study that measured it is called Over-Anxious and Underslept. It ties that rise to weakened activity in the medial prefrontal cortex and its connections to limbic regions. Deep, non-rapid eye movement sleep, the slow wave kind, brings it back down. The same paper reports that even modest night-to-night reductions in sleep predict day-to-day increases in anxiety. Your bad Tuesday may be a fact about the previous Monday night. The last step is to take the threat out of the room altogether. A healthy volunteer with no diagnosis sits calmly and takes a full vital capacity lungful of air enriched to 35% carbon dioxide. Within about 10 to 15 seconds, the heart is racing, the breath will not come, and the person reports terror. Then it fades almost as fast as it arrived. Nothing in the room changed. Nobody threatened them, and there were no electrodes. The alarm fired on a chemical reading of their own blood. What the gas shifts is brain acidity, and what registers the shift is chemical sensing rather than anything the person could have seen. Which sets up the result that decides how deep this goes. There is a rare genetic disease that destroys the amygdala on both sides while leaving the rest of the brain intact. In 2013, 3 such patients were tested. One of them is the woman known throughout the literature for being unable to feel fear. Researchers had walked her through haunted houses, handed her snakes and a knife, and got nothing back. Then they gave the 3 of them one breath of the gas, and all 3 had full panic attacks. For the woman who could not be frightened, it was the first time she had reported fear in any setting since childhood. The machinery for being afraid of the world was gone. The machinery for this was not. Now the objections, and they are not small. The strongest of them is aimed at the whole paradigm. The person under the green triangle has electrodes taped to their wrist. They signed a consent form that used the word shock. They know what the danger is, what it will feel like, and when the session ends. What has been made unlocatable is the timing and nothing else, which is objectlessness in the small. The laboratory has modelled the structure of dread. It has not touched its metaphysics, and no amount of startle data closes that gap. The drug result is also weaker than it sounded when I said it. The follow-up study built to validate the model, published in 2009, tested 3 compounds against placebo. Its primary analysis reported that none of the treatments reliably reduced either kind of potentiated startle. The alprazolam contrast reached significance only after 2 subjects were dropped for showing negative effects under placebo. The author's own conclusion was that methodological issues still hamper the application of this model. That is the field's cleanest wedge between fear and anxiety, and its headline depended on an exclusion. Then there is the picture almost everybody carries, in which the amygdala is the fear centre. In 2017, 2 researchers reviewing that history called the simplification fateful. They pointed at what happens when you stop using cues on screens. In one study, a rat left shelter to get food while a robotic predator lunged at it. Its amygdala neurons did the opposite of what the threat coding model predicts. Their firing rates dropped sharply, going nearly silent near the predator. That is a rat with a machine, and it licenses nothing about human dread. It also means the popular picture is being argued about by the people who built it. Underneath all of this runs a fight about what any of these measurements are measurements of. One camp, led by Joseph LeDoux, puts it this way: the mechanisms that detect and respond to threats are not the same as those that give rise to conscious fear. He states the historical error in the first person. He and others called the brain system that detects and responds to threats the fear system. That was a mistake that has led to much confusion. Hear the admission in that. A rat freezing is a rat freezing. On his account, calling that frozen rat afraid smuggles in a feeling nobody measured. The reply from the animal behavior tradition is blunt. Defensive behavior and physiology are legitimate ways to study fear. Ruling them out would gut the science and throw away the only mechanistic access anyone has. Notice what neither side disputes. Both accept the startle results and both keep the two states apart. The quarrel is about which of them gets to be called fear. So the state survives the audit, because the state was never waiting on the audit's results. It can be manufactured in a room where nothing happens by removing a schedule. It can be manufactured by one breath of gas in a person whose fear machinery has been destroyed. It can be manufactured by one short night. And none of that explains the thing you actually do. Nobody is paying you. There are no electrodes on your wrist, and no experimenter is scheduling the shocks. You run the audit yourself every night for free. Part 3. What the worrying is actually buying. A questionnaire, 2 sheets with an agreement scale down the right margin. First sheet, first item, I worry to guard against sudden shifts in my mood. Second item, worry keeps me in a bad mood. Third, if I worry about the worst outcome, I will appreciate it more when it turns out okay. Second sheet, I maintain a negative mood because it makes it easier to cope when bad things happen. And it really throws me off when I suddenly feel very bad. Those are not a researcher's description of anxious people. They are sentences that people with generalized anxiety disorder agreed with about themselves in the first person. Compare them with people who do not have the diagnosis. The gap is between roughly 2 and 3 standard deviations, which in this literature is enormous. So here is the question the rest of this part is going to answer. What would a person have to be doing for those to be the true sentences about them? The field's first serious answer arrived in the 1980s from Thomas Borkovich, and it is the answer most people still carry. Start with the premise it rests on, because the premise is well evidenced and probably true. Imagining a catastrophe in pictures fires the body. Heart rate climbs, the skin conducts, the muscles prepare. Describing the same catastrophe in words does far less of that. Second premise, worry is words. Sampled in the moment, the worry of a person with generalized anxiety is predominantly verbal, a running commentary rather than a film. Put the two premises together and something follows. Talking to yourself about the crash produces less bodily response than seeing the crash. So the moment your mind slides from the image into the commentary, an unpleasant physical state is cut short. Anything that cuts short an unpleasant state is a reward, and rewards are what keep behavior running for decades. That is the first half of the theory, and the second half is where it becomes tragic. Fear only unlearns itself when the fear machinery is switched fully on and then contradicted. Worry keeps it switched half on. So the fear is never disconfirmed, survives intact, and generates the next round of worry. There was a laboratory result underneath this, and it was a good one. In 1990, Borkovich and a colleague took people who were frightened of public speaking and showed them a feared speaking scene 10 times over. The only thing that differed between groups was what they thought about for 30 seconds beforehand. The ones who spent those 30 seconds worrying showed a flattened heart rate response to the image. The image arrived and found the alarm already ringing, so nothing changed and nothing was learned. Then the field took that result apart, and it was largely the same field that did it. The first problem was arithmetic rather than theoretical. If you measure the response to the frightening image starting from the end of the worry period, you are using worry as your zero. A study in 2000 made the point flatly. Measured against a resting baseline taken before the worry began, there is no muting effect at all. The suppression was partly an artifact of where the ruler was laid down. The second problem was worse. A study in 2010 split anxious participants by whether they already had raised sympathetic arousal at rest. Only those who did showed the muted reactivity. Those who did not reacted to stresses normally, which means the flatness was not an achievement of avoidance, but an inability to climb any higher from an already elevated floor. The third problem hit the theory's own prediction, and it took 2 experiments. One term first, because both experiments turn on it. Verbal worry is abstract thinking, talking about the thing rather than seeing it. Now the first prediction. Pictures should hit the body harder than words do. So high worriers were instructed to picture their feared outcomes instead of talking to themselves about them. The larger emotional response the model requires did not appear. The second prediction is about the words rather than the pictures. Abstract thinking should blunt what a person feels. So take people who are already in a low mood and train them to think that way. Their mood gets worse, not flatter. 2 predictions the model made itself, tested on its own terms, and both results came back the wrong way round. So the direction of the effect went the other way. Newman and Lehrer's 2011 review assembled it. Worry raises heart rate, elevates skin conductance, and raises self-reported negative feeling compared with neutral tasks, with relaxation and with baseline. Ambulatory monitoring reported in the same review pushed it further. Worry episodes kept cardiac activity elevated for 2 hours after the episode ended. That held independent of mood, physical activity, posture, age, body mass, smoking, alcohol, coffee, and time of day. That last list matters, because that is a long list of the things that could otherwise have explained it. Every worry episode is a 2-hour cardiovascular commitment, which is worth holding against the standard consolation that a little anxiety sharpens you. That sentence has a citation behind it from 1908. Dancing mice were given calibrated electric shocks while learning to tell a white box from a black one. The author's actual finding was that the harder the discrimination, the weaker the shock that produced the fastest learning. Their own summary is that a difficult habit may be acquired readily only under relatively weak stimulation. For hard work, the law points down. If worry raises everything the body does under threat and keeps it raised for 2 hours, then worry is not avoidance of feeling bad. Something is still being avoided, because the behavior persists for decades and nothing persists for free. The film clip experiment tells you what. Participants were put through a worry induction, a relaxation induction, or a neutral one, and then shown a frightening film. Those who had just been worrying showed markedly less initial response to the film than those who had just relaxed. But there was no difference in how bad anyone felt during the film itself. The reduction was in the jump, not in the destination. Add one more premise, which is old and well supported. How bad an event feels depends on the state it interrupts. The same bad news lands harder on a good afternoon than on a mediocre one, because impact is measured against what preceded it. Now, the strategy is legible. Suppose what you cannot tolerate is the drop rather than the depth. Then the correct move is to keep yourself permanently somewhere moderately bad, from which no drop is available. And worry does that immediately, reliably, every single time you use it. You are not worrying in order to feel better. You are worrying so that you are never caught feeling good. Which puts the 4 items in the dark in a new light. Job, health, money, the people you love, all coming back clean is not a failed search. A clean sweep delivers exactly the unguarded, nothing is wrong condition this system exists to prevent, so the sweep cannot be allowed to finish. The list has to issue a new item, and it always does. On this account, the failing sweep is what the audit was built to produce. Here is what that looks like from outside, in a room. 2 people are about to do something stressful, and each is offered a guided relaxation exercise first. The person without an anxiety disorder takes it and afterwards rates it as more helpful than sitting there worrying, which is what most people would predict. The person with generalized anxiety rates the reverse. They rate staying worried as more helpful than relaxing, and rate worry as making them better able to cope. They also report feeling worse. Both of those ratings are sincere. What they found helpful was not the absence of distress, because there was more distress, and they said so. There is a clinical version of this that anyone who has sat with anxious people recognizes. A patient with a struggling marriage says she would rather her husband left her now than wait and see whether things improve. She is not indifferent to the outcome, and she is not being dramatic. She is choosing the disaster over the suspense, because the disaster can be occupied and the suspense cannot. Standing in the bad state is survivable. Being lifted into hope and then dropped is the thing being avoided. Now the part where this account is weakest, and it is weak in a way that should bother you. The preference finding is self-report of how helpful something felt. People said worry made them better able to cope. Nobody watched anyone choose worry over calm when the choice cost them something, and stated preferences and revealed preferences come apart constantly. The questionnaire I read out at the start discriminates almost perfectly between the diagnosed and the undiagnosed, which sounds like a mechanism being detected. It was validated on undergraduates who were not seeking treatment and were never given a diagnostic interview, mostly young and mostly female. And a scale whose items closely resemble the symptom scales it is being checked against will discriminate beautifully whether or not any mechanism is real. The deepest objection is about shape. The model is confirmed when anxious people stay miserable. It is confirmed again when they turn out to be uncomfortable with sustained happiness. A theory arranged that way has left no observation that could embarrass it. Newman and Lehrer call their own model preliminary and an extension rather than a replacement. 2 things stop that objection being fatal. The model went out and staked a claim against its nearest rivals. It predicted anxiety symptoms over and above intolerance of uncertainty and negative problem orientation, which is the opposite of hiding. And its treatment prescription is genuinely risky because it inverts standard practice. It says relax the patient first and then walk them into the feared outcome, so that the contrast itself is what gets practiced. That is a strange thing to recommend unless you believe the contrast is the target. Note also what didn't happen to the older theory. The classical account kept its question, which was what worry is for, and kept its conclusion that worry blocks the fear from ever being processed. What it lost was the sign on one physiological arrow. But something in this is still unaccounted for. If the point of the exercise is to hold a braced state, the content of the worry is disposable. Any item would serve as well as any other. The state is what is wanted, not the subject matter. And yet the subject matter arrives every time, fully formed, with a name and a case and an argument you could put to a friend. The mortgage, the mole on your shoulder, the thing you said in the meeting in March. Never the feeling on its own, always the feeling with a file attached. So where does the file come from? Part 4. The evening everything stops mattering. It is a Tuesday and nothing has happened to him. The flat is warm. The work is finished and none of it was late, and nobody he loves is in any trouble. He has the whole evening free, which is what he wanted on Monday. And somewhere between the kettle and the sofa, the room goes strange. The book he had been looking forward to is paper with print on it. The plans for Saturday are entries. His job is a thing he does. Nothing has been taken away, everything is exactly where it was, and it has simply stopped pulling. In the morning, his partner asks what was wrong last night, and he gives the only honest answer available. It was nothing. Everyone who hears that sentence treats it as a hole in the report. There was something, he cannot retrieve it, and with sleep or patience or a better vocabulary, the object will eventually surface. That reading is reasonable. Emotions are normally about things. You are angry at someone, afraid of something, and the something can be named and in principle removed. A state with no object looks like a state whose object has gone missing. In 1927, Heidegger takes the sentence literally instead and builds an argument on it. His account of fear comes first, because the contrast carries everything. Fear has what he calls a before which, and that before which is always some entity inside the world. It approaches from a determinate region. The dog is in that yard, the letter is in that envelope, the scan is on that date. Which is exactly why fear is answerable. Remove the thing, or leave the region, and the fear leaves with it. Anxiety has a before which too, and his claim is that it is being in the world as such. That means the bare fact of finding yourself in a world at all, with things mattering to you. That has no region to arrive from, and no distance you could put between yourself and it. You cannot step out of it the way you step out of a yard. His phrase for the indefiniteness is the one usually rendered in English as the nothing and nowhere. What the state shows on his account is a collapse, and the collapse is total and all at once. Ordinarily, every object around a person is for something. That something is for something further, and the chain runs all the way up to what he is living for. The kettle is for tea, the tea is for the evening is for a life he is in the middle of having. In anxiety, that whole web goes at once, and the world stops having any significance at all. Be exact here. because this is where the popular version goes wrong. The things do not vanish. One English rendering of the 1929 lecture has it precisely. They are indeed still there, but we have nothing more we can hold on to. Their hold goes, not their existence. That is what keeps this from being a description of hallucination, and it is also the whole philosophical payload. The significance was never a property of the hammer. It was a function of a person being in a world, and anxiety demonstrates that by switching it off while leaving the hammer on the table. So the man's answer at breakfast is not an evasion. It is a report, and it is accurate. Now the same structure made personal. A man is standing at a high place behind a rail. The rail is solid, and he can feel it against his hands, and he is not going to fall, and he knows it. Something rises anyway. That is the dizziness this video started from. What appals him is the discovery that nothing whatever is holding him there except himself. Sartre turns that discovery into a clean cut, and the cut is by object rather than by intensity. Fear is of the world. Anguish is of me, because I am the one who will decide, and nothing decides for me. Take the case he is remembered for. A man has sincerely resolved never to gamble again, and he means it, and months later he walks toward the tables. The resolution is still there. He remembers making it, remembers the force of it, and finds it completely inert. It has become a fact about his past, and facts do not obligate. Nothing already true about him decides what his hand does next. Tillich then states the mechanism in a shape a clinician could go and test. His distinction is about addressability. Fear has a definite object that can be faced and acted on. Anxiety does not. And what has no where can be neither fought nor fled. The helplessness is not a matter of the danger being large. It is that there is nothing there to act on. You know the reach that follows. Within minutes, something has to be found that can be worked on. His position is standardly put this way. Anxiety strives to become fear, because fear can be met by courage. Not, I have a problem, therefore I am anxious. Rather, I am anxious first. The objectless form is unendurable, because there is nothing in it to do anything about. So an object is seized on, or inflated or invented, until the state becomes one that action can address. The lump, the email, the noise the car is making. A named fear is a relief. That is what the naming is for. You buy an object, and the object costs something. Tillich's name for the permanent version of that trade is neurosis, and he describes it without contempt. Think of a man who has arranged a life in which nothing unpredictable can happen. He takes the same route, keeps the same hours, declines the invitation, does not apply. Every day is defended. Nothing frightening occurs, and he is not lying about that. And the life has the diameter of a room. He won his fight with anxiety. The price was the size of the life, and a price like that is paid in installments over 40 years without any single payment being noticed. The clinical literature has a name for the installments and a measurement to go with them. It calls them safety-seeking behaviours, the small precautions a frightened person takes so that the feared thing will not happen. In 1999, patients with panic disorder did one brief exposure each. Some were asked to keep their usual precautions, some to drop them. The ones who dropped the precautions showed significantly greater decreases in catastrophic belief and in anxiety within 2 days. Hold that result. We will come back to what the precaution was doing. Now take the man's Tuesday evening, exactly as he described it at breakfast, and read it out in a consulting room. Nothing matters, the world has no hold, he cannot say what is wrong. That is a decent clinical description of depression. And one prominent reader of Heidegger says exactly that, not as a debunking, but as an identification. The mood the philosophy is built on is the illness. So the man is left holding a question about his own evening. Did he have a disclosure about being alive, or did he have an episode? There is a reply, and he is the one who has to take it or refuse it. The reply says his evening was the occasional showing of something that holds the whole time. Being in a world at all is anxiety on that reading, whether or not anyone is currently feeling it. So the Tuesday was a window, not a symptom. But look at what he pays for that. On Wednesday, the book was a book he wanted to read again, and on that reading, the Wednesday counts for nothing. If the good days are no evidence against the structure, then nothing he ever experiences can settle it either way. He is being handed a claim his own life cannot check, and neither can yours. That is not a knockdown, and it is not a rescue either. Tillich has a line between the anxiety to be born and the anxiety to be treated, and it will not help him either. Critics read him as committed to this. Pathological anxiety is what results from failing to face the existential kind courageously. No clinician can apply that, and it licenses precisely the moralizing this video refuses. A panic disorder is not a failure of nerve, any more than a broken leg is a failure of walking. And the man 2 floors down would want a word about the whole picture. He works 2 jobs, and he is not short of things making demands on him. The rail, the gambler, the free Tuesday evening. Each of them presupposes a wide set of options, and the leisure to notice them. The reply that actually helps is not a defence, it is a prediction. Suppose the pressure is constant, while the supply of large absorbing objects varies with circumstance, then people in the most constrained situations should be buying more sharply, not less. The object will just be smaller and nearer to hand. What has been established is that the object is bought, and that explains the rotation. Settle the health worry, and the money worry inflates to fill the room it left. What it does not explain is what the object is being bought to get away from. Tillich's answer is non-being. Heidegger's is the world as such. Both of those are very large words, and neither can be checked. 100 years ago, somebody gave a smaller answer than either of those, and a checkable one. Part 5. The Thing Your Checklist Has No Column. For, in 1926, a short and badly organized book appeared in Vienna under a title that reads like a filing label: Inhibitions, Symptoms, and Anxiety. Its author was 70. His own verdict on it, reported by his biographer, was that it took back many of his former conclusions and in general was not good. He was right that it was a mess. In the 4th chapter there is one sentence that cancels 30 years of his own work. It was anxiety which produced repression, and not, as I formerly believed, repression which produced anxiety. That sentence is doing something plain in difficult clothing, so take the two halves apart. Repression is the mind pushing something out of awareness and keeping it out. On the theory Freud had held since 1895 that pushing was the cause. Excitation that never got discharged went bad in storage, and anxiety was the spoiled remainder. 3 things follow from that picture, and all 3 are what he gives up. Anxiety is a byproduct rather than an act. It is backward-looking, because it is what is left when something failed to happen. And it is about nothing, since a chemical residue cannot be about anything. What broke the picture was the phobias. A patient with a phobia avoids, and the avoidance is exquisitely well aimed and pointed forwards in time. Freud went back to the case of a small boy he had treated years earlier and read it again. The conclusion he came to was that the fear had been the motive force of the repression. If the fear is the reason the mind does the pushing, the fear cannot be what the pushing leaves behind. Set the argument out so you can test it yourself. First premise: repression is selective. The mind does not evict everything, it evicts this and keeps that. Second, any selective operation needs a criterion, something in virtue of which this one goes and that one stays. Third, in the phobia cases, that criterion is a specific anticipated danger. Fourth, the danger is registered as a feeling and not as a proposition, which is to say, it is registered as anxiety. The conclusion is forced. The anxiety is there before the defense, and it is the defense's reason. But a problem appears inside the new theory. The anxiety that motivates cannot be the full overwhelming version. A person in that state is not mobilized, he is incapacitated, and he does not organize a careful avoidance of horses or lifts or telephones. So the motivating anxiety has to be a small dosed reproduction of the overwhelming state. Freud has 2 sentences for this. Anxiety, he says, is not newly created. It is reproduced as an affective state on the model of an already existing memory picture. And the ego has only to give a signal of unpleasure in order to attain its object. Unpack both slowly. The first says the state is a replay of something already recorded in you. The second says the replay does not have to do the work itself. It only has to be unpleasant enough that the rest of you starts running from it. Here is the scene that theory was built out of, and it is domestic and quiet. An infant is left alone once too long and is overwhelmed by it. Nothing dramatic happens afterwards. But weeks later the mother stands up, picks up a bag, and turns towards the door. The child produces a small dose of the same distress before anything has happened. The room is warm. She is 3 feet away. She will be back inside a minute, and she always has been. The scream after 20 minutes alone is one thing. The whimper as the door handle turns is another, and the difference between the 2 is the entire theory. The first is a state suffered. The second is a state issued deliberately in a small quantity, on the model of the first. It warns that this configuration has previously preceded something the child could not handle. Nothing in the room justifies the whimper, and the child's own history justifies it exactly. Now the general claim. The situations that reliably produce anxiety across a human life have almost nothing in common as events. Being born, the mother leaving the room, losing her love while she is still in it, the threat of bodily damage, the verdict of your own conscience. These do not resemble each other at all. and they produce the same affect with the same expressive form. When wildly different causes produce one identical effect, they are alike under some description, and the job is to find it. One description fits all of them, and nothing else in the list does the same work. This is a situation in which I will be unable to master what is about to happen to me. So the content of anxiety is a predicted property of you, and not a property of the world. Which means the two things you say about yourself stop contradicting each other. Nothing is wrong and something is wrong. The checklist ranges over the world and the alarm ranges over your projected capacity, and both can be accurate at the same time. That is why the household metaphor everybody reaches for gets it subtly wrong. It is not a smoke detector predicting smoke. It is a low battery warning, firing on the conditions under which this system has previously gone down. Sanderson ran an experiment in 1989 that isolates that, and it is nearly cruel in its simplicity. Patients with panic disorder breathe air enriched with carbon dioxide, which reliably produces the symptoms of an attack. Half of them are told that a light will come on, and that when it does, they can turn a dial and reduce the concentration. The dial is not connected to anything. The gas is identical in both groups, breath for breath. The people who believe they can turn it down report substantially less anxiety. The world was held constant, and the belief about your own capacity was varied, and the anxiety followed the belief. The same variable shows up before anyone is ill. In 1999, Schmidt followed 1,300 military recruits through 5 weeks of basic training. What predicted who would go on to have spontaneous panic attacks was how frightened they already were of their own arousal. That held after controlling for whether they had ever panicked before. And the strongest predictor among those fears was the fear of losing your mind, ahead of the fear of your body's sensations. Say plainly what the signal is, though, and the word starts to give way. To say the mind emits a signal of danger may just be to re-describe the fact that the person becomes frightened in advance. It names no mechanism, and there is a worse question sitting inside it. Who receives the signal? Something has to detect the approaching danger before the warning goes out, and something has to read the warning when it lands. Whatever does that already has the discriminating capacity the signal was invented to explain. The theory has put a small person inside the person, and the small person needs the theory all over again. There is a reply. The thing that reads a signal need not be a second self. Work on threat processing outside awareness suggests a system can register a danger and act on it before any of it reaches consciousness. That makes the reader a process, not a person. But the reply borrows a neuroscience the 1926 theory had no claim on, and the framework it borrows is itself contested in its own journal. The harder attack is empirical, and it comes from the theory's own descendants. The modern version drops the metapsychology and keeps the skeleton. On David Barlow's account, clinical anxiety is a future-oriented mood state. Its core is a sense of uncontrollability over events and over your own reactions to them. Same claim, no drives, and a questionnaire attached. In 2013, Barlow's own centre in Boston ran what its authors call the first comprehensive multivariate test of that model, roughly 700 outpatients. Taken on its own, perceived control correlated strongly with every disorder they measured. Hold temperament constant, and it survives for only 2 of the 4, with effects the authors themselves describe as weak. Their own conclusion is careful. The findings, they say, do not provide strong support for the conceptual position that perceived control is germane to the full range of emotional disorders. Nearly all the explanatory variants were shared with plain old neuroticism, the general disposition to feel bad things strongly. The measure has 2 halves, and the old theory says in advance which one should live. If what the alarm reads is your own capacity rather than the room, then control over events out there should stop predicting. Control over your own states should keep predicting. Control over the room, over the gas, over the events out there, mostly dissolved into general negative temperament. What still predicted the worry and obsession disorders was control over your own emotional states. The half the old theory named in advance is the half that came through. It is one decomposition inside one's study and should not be sold as more. What survived the statistics was the dial, and not the gas. Which leaves the argument in a strange place. You have already seen in a laboratory what happens when the same shock is made impossible to time. The body stops spiking and starts idling. Suppose the alarm is reading your predicted capacity rather than the room. Then asking how often it has been right about the room is asking the wrong question. There is a right question about how often an alarm should be wrong. Unlike almost everything else in this field, it has an exact answer in numbers. Part 6. A good alarm has to be wrong. Almost every time. How wrong should an alarm be? Not how wrong is yours. How wrong should a well-built one be, one designed by someone competent, with no constraints on the budget? Most people's answer is approximately never. That answer is not merely optimistic, it is arithmetically impossible, and the arithmetic is short enough to do out loud. Start with the reasonable version, because it is genuinely reasonable. The detector in your hallway is supposed to report a fact about the world. There is a fire or there is not, and the device should say which. So when it goes off at burnt toast on a Tuesday morning, that looks like a fault in the device. After the 5th time, the homeowner stands on a chair and takes the battery out. He is doing sound local cost accounting. The alarm has been wrong every single time so far, and the noise is real, and the toast is real. Hold that man in mind, because the argument is going to come back for him. Here is what he has got wrong, and it takes 3 quantities. The first is the cost of responding. The second is the cost of not responding when the danger is actually there. The third is the probability that the danger is there, given the cue. Randolph Nesser, writing in 2019, states the rule in one line. Fitness is maximized by expressing the response whenever that probability exceeds the ratio of the 2 costs. Fitness here just means surviving long enough to have descendants, not anything about how the day felt. The cheaper the response relative to the disaster, the lower the probability at which acting starts to pay. His worked example uses calories, so you can check it yourself. Running away from a rustle in the grass costs about 100 calories. Being caught by a lion costs about 10,000. So the expected cost of not running is 10,000 multiplied by the chance a lion is there. That exceeds 100 as soon as the chance passes 1 in 100. An organism built to survive therefore sets its trigger at 1%. And now count the firings. If it fires at every cue carrying a 1% chance, then 99 times out of 100, nothing was there. Ness's own sentence, this means that 99% of responses will be false alarms that are nonetheless normal. Then comes the part people skip. Consider the system they say they want, the one that fires only when the lion is genuinely present. To do that, it would have to wait until the evidence was near certain. But the thing that supplies near certain evidence of a lion is a lion at close range. A 0 false alarm rate is not a better alarm. It is a system that fires too late to be an alarm at all. Earliness and accuracy trade against each other, and there is no setting that gives you both, which makes the rate of wrongness portable. The rate is the ratio of two costs, and nothing else. Make the response 100th as expensive as the disaster, and you have license being wrong 99% of the time. Make it 1,000th, and you have license 99.9%. You can read the wrongness of any alarm straight off how much worse the miss is than the response. That is a stipulated lion and a hypothetical hallway, and you would be right to want it measured. It has been. Over 31 consecutive days, the intensive care units of one San Francisco hospital recorded every alarm its bedside monitors produced across 461 patients. These are devices built by engineers with regulatory pressure, commercial incentive, and dead patients as the failure mode. The count was 2,558,760 alarms. Of the arrhythmia alarms that were annotated one by one, 88.8% were false positives. And of the true ventricular tachycardia events, only about 7% lasted long enough to be worth treating. 2.5 million alarms in 31 days. Nearly 9 in 10 were false, and of the true tachycardia alarms, 93% still were not worth acting on. Alarm fatigue is the industry's own name for what happens next, and the alarm fatigue literature exists because staff then stop responding. Somebody turns the volume down. Somebody widens the threshold. The man on the chair with the battery in his hand is a nurse now, and he is still doing sound local cost accounting. The wrongness of the alarm was never the defect. It was the price the design already paid in advance for firing early enough to matter. Now I want to take that away from you. This argument is normally sold with a comfort and a license attached, and then I want to turn on the argument itself. The comfort first. From 99% of firings being false in the long run, nothing whatever follows about tonight except a base rate. And the base rate is not reassuring once you look at how it was set. If the system is calibrated and it has fired, that firing carries a real probability at or above the threshold. The threshold was chosen precisely because that probability was worth acting on. It is the same structure as being told that most lumps are benign. True and useless because the whole point of the screening threshold was to catch the minority. It gets worse under inspection. Any information that would let you sort tonight's true firing from tonight's false one would already have been built into the threshold. An optimal system is optimal, given the cues it has. So the uncertainty left over at the moment of firing is, by construction, uncertainty you cannot resolve from the inside. And there is no license here either. A policy of ignoring alarms because most are false is just raising the threshold. Raise it and you buy back the quiet by paying for the misses. That is the 10,000 calories, and the arithmetic already told you what it costs. What survives is smaller and honest. The presence of the alarm is not evidence that you are broken, and its wrongness is not evidence that you are irrational. That is the entire payout, and it is less than people come for. The second thing that does not survive is the argument's own premise. Everything above runs on the response being cheap. 100 calories against 10,000 is what licensed the 1% trigger. But the state we are actually discussing is not a sprint. It degrades goal-directed attention and eats working memory, so the anxious person reaches the same output by spending more to get there. It carries measured cardiovascular and mortality costs, and it is counted in years, not in seconds of running. Once the response costs that much, the ratio moves and the arithmetic stops licensing the low threshold. The smoke detector principle explains the momentary false alarm well and the 3 in the morning decade badly. So something else has to explain the decade, and one model does it without needing anything to be broken. Meekham and Bergstrom in 2016 built a forager that has to learn a fact about its world. It is a fox, and the fox digs burrows. A burrow holds a rabbit or it holds a badger, and the fox does not know whether badgers are rare here or common. Give it a mathematically optimal learning rule and put it in a genuinely good world, one where badgers really are rare. About 11% of the population still concludes the world is dangerous and stops digging. Now run it the other way, in a genuinely bad world. In the simplest version of the model, fewer than 1 in 200 makes the opposite mistake. In the richer version, about 1 in 22. The asymmetry is produced by the caution itself. 2 bad burrows early and the animal stops sampling, and once it stops sampling, no evidence can arrive that would correct it. Its belief is now permanently wrong and permanently unrefuted, and every single step that took it there was the correct step given what it knew. Nothing is broken. No threshold is miscalibrated for the species. The animal is trapped anyway. There is a live objection to all of this that I do not think has been answered. The philosophical literature presses what is called the matching problem. To run the argument properly, you would have to show 3 things. That a present mechanism corresponds to one that was selected for, that it descends from that one, and that it has kept its function. There is no method for establishing any of the 3. Applied here, it bites hard. From the inside of a panic attack, you cannot tell which of 3 things you have. A broken defense, a well-built defense in the wrong world, or a well-built defense doing exactly its job. The reply available is the one I would make, and it concedes a lot. The inequality is not a hypothesis about the Pleistocene. It is a theorem about any decision made under uncertainty with lopsided costs, which is why smoke detectors, military radar, and cancer screening all show the same inflation. So lean on the arithmetic and give up the history. But notice what that costs. A theorem tells you what an optimizing system would look like. It does not establish that human anxiety is 1. Even at full strength, though, the arithmetic only covers the firing. It explains why an alarm goes off in a room where nothing is happening. It says nothing about the next 4 seconds, and the next 4 seconds are the strange part. You do not lie there at 3 in the morning experiencing an unattributed rise in arousal. By the time you are awake enough to notice, there is always something you are worried about. It is never blank. Part 7. Why it always ends up being your chest. You are sitting still and your chest is tight. Not painful exactly. Tight. And now your hand is flat on your sternum and you are counting. Underneath the counting, you are running the arithmetic on how old your father was. This is the second time this month. The scan last year was clear, and you know it was clear, and the knowing does nothing. Notice the order of events. Something arrived first, and then a subject arrived for it, and the subject was the nearest available part of you. The common-sense reading of that evening is the reasonable one, and it is worth stating properly before it breaks. A tight chest is a message from a chest. The body has better access to itself than you do. It has noticed something, and it is reporting. On that reading, the sensible response is exactly what you did, which is to attend to the chest and rule out the heart. The trouble is a 100-year-old objection that the reading has never answered. Walter Cannon pressed it against the first modern theory of emotion, and it is short. The visceral changes that come with fear and the visceral changes that come with anger are not distinguishable. The heart does the same thing in both. So the arousal cannot tell you which state you are in, because the arousal is the same across states that are nothing like each other. Something other than the body is doing the sorting. Here is the strongest current answer, built one step at a time. Your brain generates a continuous summary of the body's condition, and that summary is very small. 2 dimensions, roughly, how unpleasant and how activated. That is what affect is, on this account, and it is running all the time, whether or not anything is happening. Now, the crucial property. A summary that's small cannot specify its own cause. Unpleasant and highly activated is compatible with a coming argument, a coming illness, a room that is too hot, and 11 other stories. The signal is thin, and the possible explanations are indefinitely many. But a body cannot wait for certainty. Heart rate, blood sugar, and breathing have to be set before the demand arrives, not after. So the brain has to bet on what is coming. Betting means picking a cause, and picking a cause means naming a thing. That is where the object comes from. That account has a name in the field. Emotions get constructed from a small body signal plus a concept. And when nothing in the room qualifies, the process does not stop. It goes looking for a candidate. Philosophy of emotion had already described that shape without the neuroscience. One influential account says a mood is not objectless in the way people assume. It has a generic object, and it watches out for particular ones. A readiness that goes hunting for something to be about, which is a fair description of your evening with your hand on your sternum. 2 people arrive at the same party 4 minutes apart, and both feel their heart rate climb on the stairs. The first reads it as anticipation, because there is a party at the top of the stairs, and this is what parties feel like. The second reads it as the leading edge of something going wrong. One of them spends the evening talking, and the other spends it monitoring. The afferent signal was identical. The 2 evenings were not, and the difference was not in the chest. Now, the part of this that is stranger than the popular version, because the popular version says anxious people are exquisitely tuned to their bodies. They are not. A 2022 systematic review pooled the studies that had tested it. It found no consistent association between anxiety and how accurately people detect their own heartbeats. A second review from an overlapping team took the self-report side and found the opposite pattern loudly. Anxiety is associated with how negatively you evaluate bodily signals and how often you report having them. Also with how much attention you pay to them and how hard you find it to put them into words. Not better body reading. A belief about the body, running independently of the body. And on the strongest version of the account, the body that belief is about has not happened yet. What is being predicted is a chest you do not have yet. That is the position at full strength, and it is time to take it apart. The slogan version says, "The body files the report and the mind invents the reason." That slogan is 1962, and 1962 did not survive. A review 2 decades later audited every deduction from the theory and found exactly one adequately supported. Arousal from an irrelevant source will intensify an emotion you have already attributed somewhere else. That is the survivor. There is no convincing evidence that unexplained arousal creates an emotional state, and none that arousal is even necessary for one. So nobody proved that fear turns into love on a swaying bridge. Nobody proved that a feeling is just a label stuck on a pounding heart. The famous demonstrations were smaller than their reputation, and the field said so in print. What is left is narrower, and it is the claim this video can actually stand on. The reason is not invented from nothing. It is selected from whatever is nearest. There is a second objection, and this one does not fold. A rival tradition, associated most with Panksepp, points at circuits conserved across mammals. They were doing defensive work long before anything on this planet had a concept. On that view, the fear state is already fear before any categorizing touches it, and the animal evidence is not a rhetorical flourish. A rat with no vocabulary still does the whole thing. The reply available to the constructionist side is a division of labour, and it should be heard as a division rather than a victory. Grant the circuits. Grant that they fire without a concept. The claim then narrows to the conscious experience and its object, which is what you were sitting with at 3 a.m. That is a smaller thesis than the one that gets sold. And there is a live worry about whether any of this can be tested. The constructionist program treats variability as the thing to be explained. So a failure to find a consistent brain signature for fear gets counted in its favour. Critics say a theory confirmed by the absence of its own predicted marker is not making risky claims. The fashionable computational vocabulary is in similar trouble, and the concession comes from inside. Reviewing the field's progress in 2024, 2 of its own advocates wrote that applications have been wide-ranging but piecemeal, seldom grounded in real-world empirical study. And they acknowledge that the framework has largely been superimposed onto theories that already existed. Superimposed is the word to sit with. The vocabulary got laid over explanations that already existed, and the explanations did not change. A theory that renames what we already knew has not yet risked anything. So the honest position is modest. Then the invoice arrives, and modest stops being the whole story. The economic burden of anxiety disorders in the United States in the 1990s was put at about $42 billion a year. The largest single component was not psychiatric treatment. It was $23 billion of non-psychiatric medical costs, 54% of the total, spent by doctors who were not treating anxiety. More than half of what anxiety costs a country is spent looking for something else. The mechanism is your evening in a hospital with numbers attached. Among young people presenting to hospital with chest pain that turned out not to be cardiac, 1 in 5 met full criteria for panic disorder. Among adults admitted with chest pain whose angiogram came back normal, nearly 3 in 10 did. In 1895, describing the syndrome he had just cut out of a Vega diagnosis, Freud offered a domestic example. A woman with anxious expectation, he wrote, will think of influenza pneumonia every time her husband coughs. That is the same process, a century earlier, without the catheter lab and without the bill. Which is what the 4-item list has quietly become. Job, health, money, the people you love, 4 drawers, and the state that arrives at 3 in the morning has to be filed in one of them. Health is the drawer nearest to hand, because your chest is in the room and your mortgage is not. So the object is chosen rather than discovered, and it lands on the body more often than anywhere else. It costs a country billions a year in tests that come back clean, which opens something nobody in this video has looked at yet. And once health is the drawer, there is something to prescribe for it. The trial that settled what got prescribed was published 3 times in the same journal in 1988. Part 8. The pill that taught you that you needed it. The drug is alprazolam, sold as Xanax, and the condition is panic disorder. The first of the 3 papers carries the headline. At the primary comparison point, 82% of the patients on the drug were rated moderately improved or better, against 43% on placebo. That is the number that went everywhere over the following decade. The second paper in the same issue reports 10 potentially serious reactions among the patients who received the drug: acute intoxication, hepatitis, mania, amnesia, aggression, depression. The third paper in the same issue took 126 patients off the drug over 4 weeks. That group relapsed significantly between the first week of the taper and the last. Rebound panic was reported by 27%. A distinct withdrawal syndrome appeared in 35% of the drug group. Nothing was concealed here. All 3 papers were printed together by the same investigators in the same volume. Only one of them travelled. Take the trial's own terms seriously, because the headline result is real. A person arrives with a state that has no object and cannot be argued out of them, and a compound removes it within the hour. Set against the audit you have been running at 3 in the morning, that is not a scandal. It is an achievement. The 20th century's answer to anxiety about nothing was to switch the state off rather than go through it, and the switch worked. What the rest of the evidence measures is what switching it off teaches. 5 years later, a controlled trial in London and Toronto ran the drug against exposure therapy and against both combined in 154 patients. Exposure here means going into the feared situation and staying in it, without the props that make it survivable. On the measures that were not about panic attacks themselves, exposure had about twice the effect size of the drug. Then came the taper, and the 2 treatments came apart. Gains after the drug were lost, and gains after exposure were maintained. The third arm is the one to slow down on. Combining the drug with exposure marginally enhanced gains during treatment and impaired improvement afterwards. 2 treatments, each of which worked on its own, added together, and the person ended up worse off later than with either alone. The premise that makes that intelligible is short. Exposure only teaches anything if the safety of the situation is what gets the credit for the fact that nothing happened. Put a working drug in the room, and there is now a second candidate for that credit. It is in the bloodstream, it is doing obvious work, and it takes the lesson away with it when it goes. That is a story about mechanism, and mechanism can be argued with. So somebody measured the belief itself. At the end of treatment, 40 people in the same program had improved. Whatever had been happening to them for the past few months had stopped happening quite so often. They had come far enough that somebody was willing to write down that they were better. You know the feeling if you have ever had it. The relief is real, and it is also slightly unsteady, because you are not sure yet what you are standing on. And each of them was asked a question that sounds like small talk. How much of this was the medication, and how much of it was you? They answered. The answers were written down and filed, and then everybody was tapered off the drug, and then the year went on. The clinic followed them to week 43. The patients who had credited the medication had more severe withdrawal symptoms and lost more of their gains than the patients who had credited themselves. The pattern appeared in the placebo group as well, though it ran stronger on the drug. What predicted whether the cure survived was not the dose. It was what the patient believed had done the work. People given a sugar pill, who believed the pill had fixed them, relapse more than people given a sugar pill who believed they had fixed themselves. You have an answer to that question about your own worst year, and nobody has ever asked you for it out loud. In this system, what the patient believes about who did the work is part of the treatment. The dial that did nothing turns up here as a column in a table. Then the years pass. The 82% enters the reviews, the textbooks, the prescribing summaries, the sales conversations in the corridors of conferences. It is a clean figure, and it fits in a sentence. The 27% stays where it was printed. It was never suppressed and never retracted, and for most of 2 decades it simply was not the number anyone reached for. 1997 Australia. A public relations firm working for a drug company issues a press release. It announces that more than 1 million Australians have an underdiagnosed psychiatric disorder called social phobia. The company is promoting a treatment for it. The government's own figures at the time put the number closer to 370,000. The campaign ran through a patient foundation in Victoria and included funding a large conference on social phobia. Years later, a senior official at the company conceded the point, without much visible discomfort. A lot of disease estimates, he said, are blown out of all proportion, and the marketing people always beat these things up. Now, refuse the moral that story is shaped to deliver, because the evidence does not support it. This is not an argument that the drugs are bad. A review of controlled trials found benzodiazepines at least as effective as the older antidepressants at reducing panic attacks. They were also better tolerated, with fewer side effects and less discontinuation. On that evidence, the prescribing shift away from these drugs and towards the newer ones is hard to account for. If you were handed a different prescription in the 1990s because the old one had acquired a reputation, the reputation was moving faster than the trials. And the cost half is just as well documented. Long-term users of these drugs perform worse than comparison groups across the cognitive domains that have been tested. Function recovers substantially after people stop. It does not come all the way back. Compared with controls, significant impairment is still there in most of those domains. Add dependence at ordinary therapeutic doses and the rebound the 1988 taper paper had already printed. Hold both halves at once and the problem stops being a moral one. The drug that removes the feeling most reliably is, for that exact reason, best placed to take the credit. It gets the credit every time the disaster does not arrive. That is the structure of the whole condition, transposed into pharmacology. The alarm has been going off, and the sentry's answer was to take the battery out. The trial that did it printed the rebound rate in the same journal the same year as the success rate. There is an open fight underneath all of this, and it is not about ethics. No mechanistically new class of anxiety drug has arrived in roughly 50 years, and promising candidates keep failing in early human trials. One diagnosis of that drought, from two researchers on the neuroscience side of the field, says the problem is conceptual. Candidate compounds are screened on defensive behavior in rodents, on freezing and startle and avoidance. The complaint that brings a person into a clinic is a feeling they can report. If those are different systems, the industry has been measuring the wrong thing for 50 years. Others reply that this splits the feeling off from the brain circuits that produce the behavior. Fear becomes one thing, and the machinery becomes another. That is the old split between mind and body, and the field spent decades getting out of it. That fight is unresolved, and nothing in the trials above settles it. The era did not end. Between 2003 and 2015, the share of American outpatient visits at which a benzodiazepine was prescribed doubled from 3.8% to 7.4%. Primary care physicians accounted for about half of those visits. Those are appointments lasting a few minutes. Part 9. Who decided this was an illness? The appointment that ends with a prescription lasts a few minutes. A diagnosis you can make in a few minutes has to be built out of what you can see in a few minutes. That constraint was designed in deliberately, and it was written down in 1980. The committee that wrote it had spent more than 2 years fighting about a single word. The word was neurosis, and what hung on it was the question of what a diagnosis is for. The manual that emerged answered by changing the subject. It stopped asking what anxiety was caused by. It started asking what it looked like, how long it had lasted, and how much it interfered with your week. The old definitions had named a hidden mechanism. The new ones named a duration, and left the mechanism to whoever wanted to argue about it later. In the same edit, the single old category was cut in two. Panic disorder went on one side, generalized anxiety disorder on the other, and what drew the line between them was a drug. A clinician had noticed that imipramine stopped his patients' panic attacks while leaving their anticipatory dread exactly where it was. One pill, two experiences, only one of them switched off. That was read as evidence of two separate mechanisms, and the boundary was drawn there. Later work did not sustain the specificity claim. The boundary stayed. Now, watch what that carving did to the case this whole video is about. The manual sorted anxiety by its objects. The phobia has its snake. The panic attack has the attack itself. Social anxiety has its room full of people who might be looking. Every one of those has something the fear is fear of, and each got a clean container. The case with no object got whatever container was left. It was named Generalized Anxiety Disorder and defined as excessive worry about everyday matters. The genuinely objectless state was not classified. It was left over and then handed small objects to hold. Your 4 items, run in order at 3 in the morning, are those small objects. Then something happened that ought to be impossible if the manual were reading nature off a page. The criteria got tighter. The 18-item symptom list of the late 80s became 6 items at the next revision, and the required duration had already lengthened to 6 months. Worry moved to the centre. A more specific definition should catch fewer people. Measured prevalence went the other way. A disorder once called rare in the general population reached a lifetime prevalence of about 5%, and the sex ratio flipped. Under the 1980 criteria, the disorder was supposed to be roughly equally common in men and women. Under the current ones, women are about twice as likely to have it. Nobody's nerves changed in those decades. A change in wording changed who exists. That is the opening for the critique most people watching already half believe, and it deserves to be built properly rather than gestured at. It runs in 4 steps. First, criterion-based diagnosis counts symptoms, counts months, and asks whether the person is distressed or impaired. Second, proportionate fear in a genuinely dangerous life produces exactly those symptoms, exactly that duration, and exactly that distress. Third, it follows that a checklist cannot separate warranted fear from malfunctioning fear because the checklist never asks what is actually happening to you. Fourth, community surveys apply those same checklists to whole populations, with nobody in the room to judge context. So a measured epidemic is partly an artifact of the measuring. The pharmaceutical inflation you already heard about, that Australian press release with its missing 600,000 people, had a very hospitable instrument to work with. Put 2 women in front of that instrument. Both report constant worry, broken sleep, muscle tension and trouble concentrating, and both have had it for more than 6 months. The first has a rolling contract, rent she covers by a margin of days, and a landlord who could end her housing in a month. The second has, by every external measure available, nothing wrong. They score the same. That is the false positive problem in one image, and it is a real problem. But look at the first woman again, because the reply is standing right next to her. Her suffering is not smaller than the second woman's. Telling her that her fear is proportionate to her situation is a correct description and not a treatment. 3 things press hard on the critique, and the first is philosophical. To say the manual overcounts disorder, the critique needs an account of what a disorder is, and the one it runs on is specific. A condition is a disorder when some internal mechanism fails to perform the job it was naturally selected to do, and that failure harms the person. Now, hold that against 3 in the morning. Whether your fear counts as a malfunction depends on what the fear system was built to do, precisely enough to say when it has failed. Nobody knows that. Many mental functions are not direct adaptations at all. Selection leaves substantial variation between individuals, so there is no single designed response to measure your shortfall against. and several conditions everyone agrees are disorders are, on their face, adaptive reactions to danger or to loss. So the question you actually want settled, whether you are ill, cannot be settled by finding out whether you are ill. There is no reading to take. The critique of the manual is not standing on firmer ground than the manual. It is standing on different ground, and the honest thing is to say so out loud. The second thing that presses on it is a number. The critique's whole shape is that the counting instrument inflates. The best test anyone has run on that question followed a birth cohort of 1,037 people. They were interviewed again and again from childhood to age 32, and 96% of them were still in the study at the end. Their lifetime rates could then be set against what population surveys get by asking adults to remember. Lifetime prevalence was approximately doubled in the prospective data for all 4 disorder types. The surveys everyone accuses of overcounting miss half of everyone who has ever been ill, because people forget episodes that ended. Both errors are real, and they do not cancel, because they are errors about different things. The third is the one that stops the argument being decisive. One Danish study went to that country's national registers to see how people with an anxiety diagnosis die. They died at somewhere between 1.5 and 2 times the expected rate, and unnatural causes were overrepresented among them. That is a single registry in a single country, and it deserves the caution. But nobody measured it with the questionnaire. A label invented by a committee and inflated by a marketing department should not predict how a population dies. The second woman is inside those registers too. The register never asked whether anything was wrong in her life. So the category survives, bruised. The worst of the bruising is in a place the critics rarely look, and it lands closer to you than to the manual. One study took a population-based sample of 1,033 female twin pairs and asked what they had inherited. The genetic factors for generalized anxiety disorder and for major depression turned out to be completely shared. Re-estimated later on a much larger national registry of twins, the genetic correlation came out at 1:0 in women and 0.74 in men. 1.00 is not a strong relationship. It is the ceiling. So whatever you inherited, you did not inherit a leaning toward this rather than toward depression. You inherited one liability, and the 2 conditions are the 2 things it can turn into. Which of them you are carrying tonight was settled by what happened to you, not by which illness you have. The author's own conclusion was that the difference is a result of environmental experience. The registers counting those deaths were counting 2 diseases that the liability itself does not distinguish. Which leaves the audit in a strange place. The category is real enough to predict how a population dies, and too blurred to separate from depression in what people inherit. The trait scale of the most widely used anxiety questionnaire in the world tracks depression more closely than it tracks anxiety. The ruler used to measure all of this may be graduated in the wrong unit, and every figure anyone has about whether there is more anxiety now was produced by instruments of that kind applied to populations across decades. Part 10. Is there more anxiety now, or are we just saying it more? So, is there more of it now, or have we only learned to say so out loud? 2 answers arrive immediately, and they contradict each other. The first says the rate has not moved in 30 years. The second says a generation is drowning. Both are quoting real figures honestly collected from serious people. Picking one and ignoring the other is a preference dressed as evidence. The flat line comes from the global burden work, which pools every population survey it can find and models the rest. Between 1990 and 2019, the age standardized prevalence of anxiety disorders sat at essentially the same value at both ends, and the estimated trend in new cases is indistinguishable from no change at all. Meanwhile, the absolute count went from about 195 million people to about 301 million. That is roughly a 50% rise in human beings carrying the diagnosis. Almost all of it is population growth and aging, rather than a rising per-person rate. One scope note before anyone quotes that at a dinner table. Nobody counted those 301 million people. The figure is the output of a model fitted to whatever surveys exist, and survey coverage is thin across most of the world. The rising line comes from asking children directly. In England, the household series is reported as roughly doubling in 6 years. The end point is the part of it I could verify, and it is about 1 in 5 children by 2023. In that wave, the children are 8 to 16, and what they screen positive for is a probable mental disorder. 2 things are worth knowing about that. Probable means a screening questionnaire rather than a diagnostic interview, and it covers all mental disorders rather than anxiety alone. And between those waves, the survey changed how it collected answers, from face-to-face interviews in people's homes to online and telephone collection. Change the way you ask a 14-year-old about their mind, and you change what comes back. Common sense says one of these 2 streams must therefore be wrong. The skeptical version of common sense picks the flat one because it is bigger and duller and looks more like arithmetic. Here is where that breaks. Age standardization reweights every year to one common age structure. That lets 2 decades be compared without the population's changing age profile getting in the way. It is a good procedure, and it has a cost. A deterioration concentrated inside one narrow age band gets averaged against every band that did not move. And the incidence of anxiety disorders peaks between the ages of 10 and 14. That is precisely the band the youth surveys are pointed at. So the 2 streams are not in a fight. One of them is reporting an average that is built to be insensitive to exactly what the other one is measuring. A flat all-age line is not evidence against a youth-concentrated rise, and a youth-concentrated rise is not evidence that all age prevalence changed. Which leaves the harder question standing. If reported anxiety went up, what exactly went up? In 2023, Falks and Andrews put a hypothesis into print about mental health awareness campaigns, and it has 2 halves. The first half is plainly good. People who genuinely had unreported problems now recognize them and say so, which is what the campaigns were for. The second half is not. Some people, they suggest, come to interpret and report milder distress as a mental health problem. And once an experience is filed under a disorder, the behavior that follows can help produce the thing the label named. They present this as a hypothesis and a call for testing rather than a finding. A year later, they split the 2 claims apart on purpose. The strong claim about producing symptoms must not be smuggled in on the back of the weak one about interpretation. That hypothesis is also a weapon, And this is the live argument about it. The historical baseline was not over-detection, it was massive under-detection, and the two errors are not symmetrical. A person wrongly told their distress is a disorder is worse off than they were. A person wrongly told it is nothing may never get help at all. And the birth cohort from Part 9, the one whose lifetime rates came out about double, cuts straight across the overcounting story. The instrument overlabels and undercounts at the same time. Before any of this gets handed to the obvious culprit, note what the best evidence on that culprit actually says. One of the most rigorous analyses of digital technology and adolescent well-being worked from a sample in the hundreds of thousands. It ran every defensible version of the analysis rather than the single version that flatters the hypothesis. The headline figure, taken from the paper's abstract, is that the association is negative and tiny. It accounts for, at most, about 0.4% of the differences in well-being between adolescents. That is not proof that phones are harmless for every subgroup. It is a small average association in self-report data. But you cannot build a generational catastrophe on 0.4% of the variance. A video that borrowed that story would be doing the thing this one keeps objecting to. What the evidence does support is narrower and much stranger. Part 2 established it in a room with 2 electrodes taped to a wrist. Hold the size of the bad thing completely fixed. Vary only whether the person can say when it is coming. The body's response changes kind. Predictability is the variable, not adversity, which turns a vague complaint about modern life into an answerable question. Is there a real domain out here where that same variable behaves the same way? There is one, and it is the labour market. Take 2 workers on the same street. The first has a household income that falls by a quarter this year. A real, realized, measurable loss, the kind that shows up on a bank statement. The second's income does not fall at all, but they cannot tell you whether their contract will be renewed in March. In the panel data, the first shows no statistically significant effect on mental health. The second shows a substantial one. The effect holds whether or not the feared job loss ever happens. It also does not change with where in the income distribution the person sits. So it is not a disguised measure of being poor. Now size that result before it carries any weight. The headline number comes from men only, and the matching estimate for women was near 0 and not significant. What was measured was general psychological distress on a screening scale, not an anxiety diagnosis. And half an hour of startle measurement under threat of a shock is not a decade under threat of redundancy. Moving from one to the other is an enormous extrapolation dressed up as a bridge. The one who lost the money was fine. The one who might lose it was not. Anxiety is not a measure of how bad your life is. It is a measure of how unresolved it is. Which is why the oldest reply in the world has never once worked on anybody. You have it better than your grandparents did. That answers a magnitude question, and magnitude was never what was being asked. And it changes what the high place in this video has been. The rail still holds and nothing is going to happen, but the edge is no longer a moment you are standing at for 90 seconds. It is a lease, a contract that renews or does not, a set of possibilities that stays permanently open. There is no step backwards available, because nothing has been settled. Now let me take that apart, because I have built more on it than it can hold. The laboratory has its own awkward result, and it is worse for me than the extrapolation charge. When the unpredictable threat task was run across several diagnostic groups, it was social anxiety and specific phobia that showed the heightened response to unpredictable threat. Generalized anxiety and depression did not differ from healthy controls. The condition that looks most like the state this whole video is about is the one that failed to show the effect. A clean unpredictability spine does not predict that. There is a reply, and it is not a rescue. The task measures a body in a room for about 20 minutes, waiting for a shock that might land at any second. The thing this part has been describing is the March your contract renews in, and the scan result nobody has phoned about. Those are different quantities, and only one of them can be run before lunch. Whatever you have been carrying for years may well startle less in that room than a fear with one shape and one trigger does. That is a hypothesis I cannot test here, and until someone does, the awkward result stands. The trend claim underneath all of that has no data holding it up. It would need a time series showing the predictability of ordinary life falling, while material adequacy stayed flat, and nobody has built one. The mechanism is well evidenced, and the trend is a conjecture, and those two should never be said in the same tone of voice. The dizziness. Part 1 described is structural, a feature of having to relate to yourself at all. A structure does not rise when the rental market tightens, so asking whether modernity increases, it may be a category error. What survives both objections is narrower. A life organized around permanently open, revisable options supplies fewer occasions on which a possibility gets closed into an actuality. And closing is the thing the self is supposed to do. The surviving claim makes a clean prediction about treatment. If the operative variable is unresolvability rather than adversity, then whatever cures this should work by resolving something. Settling the question. Getting the answer at last. The leading model of the leading treatment says something considerably stranger than that. Part 11. The session that felt worse was the one that worked. Two women with the same claustrophobia ride the same elevator on the same afternoon. The first is told to stay in it until her distress halves, and to call the number out loud as she goes. She starts at a 9. It takes 11 minutes to reach a 4, and another 2 to reach a 3. She steps out shaken and pleased, and the note in her file says the session went well. The second woman is asked something before the doors close. What do you predict will happen, specifically, and when? She says she will suffocate and pass out within 10 minutes. She rides it for 12 minutes at an 8. She comes out still at an 8, sweating and furious, certain the afternoon was wasted, and her therapist asks her exactly one question. Did you pass out? For decades, every clinic doing this work would have said the first woman had the better session. That theory deserves building properly, because it is what almost everyone believes, and it is why the distress scale exists at all. Its premises are 4. Fear is a learned response to a cue. A learned response weakens when the cue is presented over and over without the bad thing following. The falling number is that weakening, happening in the room, visible on the clock, and leaving early rewards escape, which is why the rule was always to stay until the number came down. Every piece of the standard apparatus follows from those premises. the 0 to 10 rating, the hierarchy that starts with a photograph of a lift and ends with the lift, the instruction to stay until your anxiety halves. It is a coherent theory. It generated a treatment that genuinely works, and it made one clean prediction that the field eventually got round to testing. If the within-session fall is the treatment, then people whose fear falls more in the room should do better afterwards. A 2012 study of panic patients across more than 100 exposure sessions measured it. The fall did not predict who got better. Neither the drop in the body's response nor the drop in the reported distress forecast therapeutic success. So the mechanism everyone was timing and charting and rewarding turned out not to be the thing that carried the benefit. The treatment survived. Its explanation did not. What replaced it is a claim about prediction. On this account, the learning is driven by a specific kind of surprise. The bad outcome occurs less often or less severely than the person expected. That is the active ingredient, and it has a name in the literature, expectancy violation. That phrase separates two things that feel like one. How frightened you are during the exposure is one quantity. How wrong your forecast turns out to be is another, and only the second is doing the work. The one you can feel is not the one being repaired. Every design rule in the newer model follows from that. Each one makes the session less comfortable in order to make the learning last longer. The safety signals come out, the companion, the water bottle, the seat by the door. Vary the exposure rather than grading it smoothly upward, so the person cannot settle. Combine two separately extinguished fears so the encounter is harder than either alone. And occasionally let the feared outcome actually happen, so the learning survives contact with a world that does not run on a hierarchy. The protocol refuses to let the session deliver relief, on the grounds that relief was never the ingredient. Here is what that looks like in a life. A woman with panic disorder carries a packet of lorazepam in the inside pocket of her bag. She has not taken one in 2 years. In those 2 years, she has done perhaps 100 exposures. The 8:15 train, the cinema, the supermarket at 6 in the evening when the aisles are full. None of them killed her. And nothing has been learned, because every one of those non-catastrophes has an alternative explanation sitting in her bag. The therapeutic move is to take the packet away, which feels like a cruelty and is mechanically the entire point. The argument underneath that is 3 short steps. A threat belief is disconfirmed only when the feared outcome fails to occur, and the non-occurrence is credited to the situation. A safety behavior is performed precisely because the person believes it prevents the outcome. So when the outcome does not arrive, the behavior absorbs the credit, and the belief walks away untouched, needing the behavior again tomorrow. Call that credit stealing, and notice its worst property, which is that the better the behavior works, the more necessary it becomes. Which brings the bottle into contact with the 4 items: job, health, money, the people you love. Run in the dark every night, and every night the disaster fails to arrive, and every night the audit takes the credit for that. The checklist is structurally the same object as the unopened packet. So is the reassurance text and the second opinion, and the tab left open on the search results. But the audit has 2 jobs, and credit stealing is the smaller of them. Stealing the credit is why the belief survives every clean night. Never finishing is the older reason, because a list that finished would leave you lying there calm with nothing wrong. That is the exposed condition. Part 3 said the worrying exists to prevent, so that you are never caught feeling good. The index of a good exposure is not how far the fear fell. It is how badly you were wrong, and the checklist has spent years making sure you never find out. In 2020, 29 people with generalized anxiety recorded their worries for 10 days, and then tracked what actually happened over 30. 91.4% of the predictions did not come true. The commonest score, person by person, was 100% wrong. The higher a person's proportion of untrue worries, the lower their symptoms after treatment. So the people who had been most comprehensively mistaken improved the most. That result is a problem for the account of worry this script has been running, which says worry is bracing rather than forecasting. If the worry is not really a prediction, disconfirming it should be like correcting the grammar of a shrug. It should not have moved anything, and it moved a great deal. Newman, whose model says the worry is there to keep you braced, co-authored the study that found it. Either worry does more forecasting than the bracing account allows, or writing it down converts it into a forecast. The second option is a different claim, and it needs different evidence. The newer exposure model has its own exposed flank, and it is worth naming rather than sliding past. The claim that the within-session fall predicts nothing is not settled. A reanalysis reported in a recent protocol paper used a method that sums fear reductions across an exposure and strips out drops attributable to other causes. On that measure, it did predict outcome in young people with obsessive-compulsive disorder. The field's own recent protocols concede that the fall may still be a marker of corrective learning and that the measurement question is open. Sharper still, the head-to-head trials against ordinary exposure are few, and the picture they give is not uniformly positive. The laboratory case is strong. The clinical superiority is not established, and the honest statement is that the explanation has changed rather than the results. There is a further objection, and it is the one a skeptic in the comments will make. If success no longer means the fear went down, then the treatment has quietly redefined success as whatever it can actually deliver. That is resignation with a citation attached. The reply worth giving is that the model stakes predictions that run against comfort and could lose them. Remove the safety signal, scramble the order, let the bad outcome occur sometimes, and durability should improve even though the hour feels worse. And what gets measured at the end is the count of situations no longer avoided. Whether the person is working, travelling, and living at full size. That scale would fail if this were only reframing. So the target is not the absence of the feeling, not in the leading model of the best evidence treatment, and not in any of the philosophy this video has walked through. The second woman got out of the lift still at an 8, and she was the one who learned something. She will still be somewhat afraid of lifts next month. Which leaves the question you arrived with turned over. Not what will make it stop. What are you actually allowed to expect? Part 12. What you are actually allowed to expect. You are standing at a high place, a viewing platform or a hotel balcony on the 11th floor, and the rail comes up to your chest, and it holds. Nothing is going to happen here. You are not going to fall, and you know that as steadily as you know the floor is under you. And something rises anyway, in the stomach and the backs of the legs. You take a half-step back from a barrier that was never going to give. This is the image the philosophy of anxiety started from, and it is about to point the other way. Before it does, the philosophy has to be stated in the version that is in the book, not the version that circulates on posters. The most quoted sentence in this whole subject runs like this: "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. Freedom looks down into its own possibility, laying hold of finiteness to support itself. The eye at the edge goes looking for something solid to fix on, and finds only what you are able to do. That much you already have. What almost never travels with it is the conclusion the same book reaches at its end." The summit sentence is this: whoever has learned to be anxious in the right way has learned the ultimate. Read alone, that sounds like permission to treasure the feeling. The argument underneath it is conditional, and the condition does all the work. Possibility is the only teacher that cannot be bargained with. It presents everything, including the worst, and it never discounts. A person schooled only by his own small world learns the probabilities of that world. He is destroyed the first time the improbable arrives. A person schooled by possibility has already met everything in anxiety, and nothing finite is any longer his measure. But that schooling annihilates him unless it ends in something that is not one possibility among others. The book names that terminus. It is faith. Detach the conclusion from the terminus, and what you have recommended is unlimited exposure to possibility, with nothing underneath to catch anyone, which is the state the book itself calls destruction. So any sentence of the form, "your anxiety is a gift," is a religious conclusion laundered into a therapeutic one. That is the philosophy at full honesty. Now the clinic, with the correction factors attached rather than the marketing figures. Antidepressants do beat placebo, and this is among the better evidenced things in psychiatry. Across 135 trials and about 30,000 participants, the gap over placebo is around half a standard deviation. Half a standard deviation is average movement on a symptom scale. It is not most people getting better, and it is compatible with a large minority getting nothing at all. The psychotherapy numbers need a warning before they need a figure. What you compare the therapy to changes the answer. Measured against a waiting list, cognitive behavioral therapy looks markedly better than it does against ordinary care. That is the standard complaint, and it is fair. But it does not run in one direction, and this video is not allowed the tidy version of it. For generalized anxiety, the effect measured against a pill placebo came out larger than the effect measured against a waiting list. That is the same swap run the other way, and it made the therapy look better rather than worse. Comparator choice moves the number in both directions, so there is no single subtraction that cleans this literature up. Nobody gets to say the effects halve once you pick an honest control. The honest composite has to be built from the absolute numbers instead. Across 441 trials and nearly 34,000 patients, one figure matters most. The proportion of people meeting a 50% improvement threshold ran between about a third and a bit under 2/5. A 50% symptom reduction is not the same thing as being well. Only 6.2% of the panic disorder trials were rated at low risk of bias. That is roughly 1 clean trial in 16. Beyond 12 months, the advantage for panic disorder is not statistically significant at all. The gentlest result in the literature carries the same discipline. In 2022, 276 adults with anxiety disorders were randomized to one of 2 treatments: 8 weeks of mindfulness-based stress reduction or a first-line drug. Among those who completed the course, the 2 arms finished statistically indistinguishable. Adverse events came in at 78.6% of the drug arm against 15.4% of the mindfulness arm. That is any side effect people reported of any severity. That is a real difference in what the treatment costs you. The trial's claim was non-inferiority. It means the mindfulness arm did not come out worse. Nobody showed it came out better, and both arms ended up in the same place, about 1.4 points better on a severity scale. That leaves most of the severity where it was. The leading model of the leading psychological treatment does not use the absence of anxiety as its success criterion. It uses whether a prediction was violated, which is why the session that felt worse could be the one that worked. And the philosophical tradition, arriving from theology by a route that never touched a laboratory, denies that anxiety is a malfunction to be eliminated. 2 enterprises with nothing methodological in common reject the same target. Hold that at exactly its own strength, because it is a convergence on a negative claim, and nothing more. One endpoint is reduced disability on a clinician's rating scale, measured in situations no longer avoided. The other endpoint is faith. Those are 2 different destinations, each reached by its own road. And here is the objection that goes at everything just built, which nobody in this argument has answered. Take away one night's sleep, and anxiety rises the next day. The person's circumstances have not changed by a single item, and deep, slow-wave sleep brings it back down. 8 weeks of attending to your breath moves it about as far as a serotonergic drug does. A state that responds to sleep correction and to behavioral homework looks less like a disclosure about the human condition. It looks more like a parameter. The reply usually offered is that the philosophers were describing something else, a structure rather than a symptom. But the evidence for that structure is first-person description, and the same description is the best evidence available that a clinical state was generalized into a metaphysics. Phenomenology cannot settle which, because testimony about how it seems is what both hypotheses predict. That question is open, and I'm not going to close it here. There is a second thing to turn on, and it is this video. The temptation now is to convert 2 hours of argument into a lesson. The material licenses 3 consequences and no fourth. The question, what is wrong with me, gets repriced into a different one. How predictable is the world I am actually living in? Every act of reassurance gets repriced from a coping skill into a cost. The reassurance takes the credit for the disaster that did not arrive, and so protects the belief that generated it. And the dread has to become a stated prediction, with a time and an outcome. A prediction is the only thing that can be violated, and a nameless dread cannot be. None of that licenses stopping treatment, refusing medication, or treating anxiety as a spiritual credential. None of it entails that the suffering means anything. It is worth saying where the line between ordinary anxiety and disorder actually sits. Neither side of this video put it in the right place. The philosophers put it too high, telling you that dread is the truth of the human condition. They hold that right up to the point where somebody stops eating and stops leaving the flat. The manual puts it too low, counting 3 symptoms from a list of 6 over 6 months without asking what is happening in your life. The line needs both questions. How much of your life has stopped, and how much of your world would have to change for the fear to be proportionate? The second question inherits the problem Part 9 named that nobody has a method for measuring proportion. Which brings the rail back. In 2012, 431 students were asked a slightly strange question. Had they ever stood somewhere high and felt the pull, the sudden urge to jump, with no wish whatever to die? Enough of them said yes that the researchers went looking further. In a later German sample of a few hundred adults, close to 6 in 10 reported it. It has a name in the literature now, the high place phenomenon. The paper that named it carries a title nobody expects. An urge to jump affirms the urge to live. The reason for that title is in the pattern. The urge tracks how frightened a person is of their own bodily signals, the racing heart and the swimming head. And that association was strongest among the participants with the lowest levels of suicidal thinking. The mechanism the authors propose is a misinterpreted safety signal. The body registers the edge and fires a fraction of a second before anything reaches you and pulls you back. Then the mind turns to look at what just happened, and it needs an object. The only candidates in the room are the drop and the person standing next to it. So it writes, I might jump. On the author's reading, the pull at the edge is a survival system firing. The death wish is the caption your mind wrote for it afterwards. The object was invented. What it was attached to was a signal that you are alive and reading yourself. None of this is a confirmation of the philosophy. The data establish that it is common even in people with no history of suicidal thinking, and that its link to fear of one's own body is strongest in them. They establish nothing about whether the 19th century read the vertigo correctly. 2 roots to one image is a coincidence worth noticing, and it is not evidence. The list will be there again tonight. Job, health, money, the people you love, in the same order at about the same hour. Every item will come back clean, exactly as it always has. And a new item will be waiting behind them, because the list is doing 2 jobs at once. The smaller job is credit. Every disaster that failed to arrive gets filed as evidence that the checking worked. The larger job is the one that keeps the list from ever finishing. A finished list leaves you lying there calm, with nothing wrong and no guard up. That is the exposed condition the whole system was built to prevent. So tonight the answer comes back clean, and tonight the list issues 1 more item, so that you are never caught feeling good. The only thing that has changed is that you now know what the extra item is for.